Well, welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today. On behalf of Vermont Woodlands Association and Land Ethic Vermont, we are so thrilled to be able to offer this presentation today with Tom Wessels. My name is Kate Four, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Woodlands Association. For those of you who are not familiar with Vermont Woodlands Association, we are a statewide nonprofit organization that works to promote healthy forests through sustainable stewardship. Our mission is to educate and advocate for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment of Vermont's woodlands. And we do this through providing year-round educational programs that seek to connect people to our forests and the work of caring for them. Our organization supports the stewardship of over 220,000 acres of forest land here in Vermont. And since we're talking a little bit about history today, I thought it would be interesting to note that we are Vermont's oldest forestry nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1915 by a group of forest landowners who were concerned about the threat of forest fires in Vermont at the time. While we all know today's challenges to our forests look very different, the work at Vermont Woodlands Association is still centered around supporting landowners and land managers, as well as providing a whole array of educational programs for a wide audience to help us all make informed decisions about the stewardship of our forests. And finally, just a quick plug, we are a membership organization, and so I encourage all of you to check us out online and learn more about our programs and consider becoming a member by going to www.vermontwoodlands.org. Today's presentation would not be possible without the support of one of our collaborative initiatives, Land Ethic Vermont. Land Ethic Vermont is like I mentioned, a collaboration of Vermont organizations, which includes nonprofits, state agencies, federal agencies, and other passionate individuals who are dedicated to developing, maintaining, inspiring, and promoting a land ethic among the people of Vermont with the goal of maintaining the health of Vermont's landscapes for people, wildlife, and other species. And finally, today's presentation would not be possible without the funding from Vermont Community Foundation, and we are so grateful for their support. Our presenter today, as we all know, is Tom Wessels. Tom has a special place in many of our stories about how we became interested in forests and forest stewardship. He has opened doors into the woods for countless people, opening our eyes and helping us understand what to see, what it means, and how we can make a better decision on how we manage our forests. My own personal journey into forestry started with reading his book, Reading the Forested Landscape, while an undergraduate at Bates College in Maine. I took a month-long course on forest ecology, and Tom's book, Reading the Forested Landscape, was our textbook. It was my first introduction to the understanding of forests as an ecosystem and really beginning to understand how they've been shaped over time by both human and natural disturbances. And as you can tell, I was hooked. Beyond the gift of information and insight that Tom shares in his work, I think the real gift that he offers all of us is the gift of inspiration. Through getting people engaged in learning about our forests here in New England, and especially here in Vermont, Tom has inspired so many people to see the woods in a new way and have a new appreciation for its ecology, its rich land use history, and its stewardship. Tom Wessels is an ecologist and professor emeritus at Antioch University in New England, where he founded the master's program in conservation biology. Like many ecologists, Tom is a bit of a generalist with interests that include forests, deserts, alpine and Arctic ecosystems, geomorphology, evolutionary ecology, complex systems science, and of course, the interface of landscapes and culture. Tom has written over 6 books, including Reading the Forested Landscape, The Granite Landscape, Untamed Vermont, The Myth of Progress, Forest Forensics, and Granite, Fire, and Fog, The Natural and Cultural History of Acadia. Tom has also conducted ecology and sustainability workshops throughout the United States for more than 3 decades. And so with that, we have a great slideshow lined up for Tom today. It's quite a mixed bag, so I hope he's ready. I've been thinking a lot about this presentation today and this opportunity to have a conversation with Tom as really kind of a virtual hike in the woods. And so as we get started here, I encourage all of us to strap up our boots and grab our water bottles, and let's get started. So we're going to kick things off. I'm actually going to hand things over to Tom, and Tom is going to get us started with a few opening remarks about how he approaches his work in reading the forested landscape.
Yeah, so I guess there are three things that I'm generally looking at when I enter a woodland. The first is I'm looking to see if there's changes as I'm walking through the woods in forest composition. So I might be walking an area that's dominated by hemlock and then move into an area dominated, let's say, by white pine. Now, I should mention both those tree species are generalists. They occur in a lot of different soil types. So when I see a change like that in composition, I know it's more related to a change in the history of the forest. And then I'll start looking for evidence to try to untangle what that change in history is. However, if I'm like in a hemlock forest and I wander into a sugar maple white ash forest, then I know I'm encountering a change in soils because white ash is a pretty good eco indicator of enriched soils. So whenever I see a change in composition that involves eco indicator species, species that have very narrow soil requirements, then I know I'm looking at a change in the substrate. So that's one of the things I'm looking for right away. Another one is the change in physical structure in a forest. For example, if I'm in a forest that has fairly old trees, maybe standard stem diameters up around 30 to 36 inches. And then I come into a forest that has a much denser stand of trees with much smaller stem diameters, maybe like a foot in diameter. Then I know I'm looking at a difference in disturbance history, and I'll start looking at that younger forest for evidence to figure out what happened there. And then finally, the last thing I'm generally always looking at is the superficial topography of the ground. Even if the ground is sloping, if the surface of the topography is lumpy, then I know I'm looking at an area that was never plowed to create either a crop field or a hay field. But if the surface of the ground is smooth and even if it's sloping, then I'm looking at an area that was plowed. So if it's lumpy, I'm looking at an area that has always been forested, or may have only been used as pasture. Because when the land was opened up, in Vermont back in the late 1700s, early 1800s for agricultural purposes, if it was going to be used just for pasture, the farmers came in and just cut the trees. If they stump sprouted, that'd be the first forage for the livestock. And once everything was denuded, they'd pull the animals out and then just spread grass seed on the exposed soil. But they didn't plow. The trees were not uprooted and pulled out. They just sort of rotted away and retained that lumpy nature, which is what's called pit and mound or pillow and cradle topography, which is related to live trees falling over in a forest. And I'm sure we're going to see some images of that in the slide. So I'll hold off on talking about pit and mound or pillow and cradle topography until we have an image in front of us. But I think we can just go on to the first image that we're going to look at.
Okay. Sounds like you're ready, Tom. Let's do this.
All right, I'm ready. So is this the image we're going to do?
Nope. I'm just having a little bit of a glitch here.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So here's our first photo.
All right. So what this is a weevil hit white pine. We have a native insect, the white pine weevil. It doesn't go after any white pine tree. It's only going to lay its eggs on the very upper terminal shoot of a young white pine, generally less than 15 years of age, that is growing in full sunlight because it wants a terminal shoot that's going to be about as fat as a finger, because that's the forage for its offspring. If you get a older white pine or a white pine growing up in the shade, the terminal shoot would only be about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, and that's just not enough forage there. So the weevil is very select, only choosing young white pines growing in full sunlight. It then lays the eggs on the upper terminal shoot. The eggs hatch, the larvae drill into the shoot and kill it. And then the tier of branches below that shoot take off and grow up to become the new trunks. Now, this is a really good piece of evidence because if you walk into a forest and you see a lot of weevil hit trees, and generally, if you get a forest that's loaded with them, they'll only send up 2 new trunks after the leader is killed. So the trunk will grow up and then split into 2 trunks. This tree here, this white pine in this slide, grew all by itself in the open and threw up a bunch more trunks after the leader was killed. But if you're getting a cohort of pines going up together, they all get hit by the weevil. they sense that there's not going to be a lot of light out laterally, so they'll only send up 2 new trunks. So when I see that, I know I'm walking into a forest that was once open land. And then I can date land abandonment by aging those weevil hit pine trees. Now, if a white pine is, let's say, 35 years or less, you can age it to the year because white pines put down 1 tier of limbs every year, what's called a limb whorl. Just count how many tiers of limbs there are, and you can age the pine. After about 35 years, it gets a little hard to see the top ones. But if it's, a young forest, you can usually pin down exactly when it was abandoned to grow back to forest. So weevil hit pines, very good evidence for dating events like that. And if there are any particular questions on that, we can handle it now or move on to the next one.
No, that's great, Tom. I just knowing a little bit of history of this site, this was an area that was pastured, grew up to pasture pine, and then was thinned. And so interesting to kind of hear your take on these lower leaders or lower limbs, and kind of its generalized growth form as having been opened previously, as pasture land before my understanding of the site. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm not seeing
Well,
any specific questions in the chat. However, there is one comment that they're having a hard time seeing the photo. I know that I can see the photo on my screen, but I'm wondering if anyone else is having difficulty seeing it.
So
I can't see it.
yeah, so Peter, I wonder you might want to. I wonder if you want to play with your settings in the toggle bar. It may be that you're look for gallery view under the view button. Eliza, I'm wondering, could you maybe offline help troubleshoot with Peter in the chat box?
Yeah.
And Peter, I can step in to help as well.
Okay.
But let's keep moving for the presentation. And please feel free to use the chat, though. If other folks are having an issue with either the sound or the pictures, let us know. And Peter will swoop in to help you in a second. Okay, so here's your next picture, Tom.
I love this. So this is a hemlock that was cut. And because it was root grafted to neighboring trees, the stump is still alive. And what we're seeing is the callus wood growing over. And if you look up at around, well, think of like the cut stump as being a clock. If you look up at around 2 o'clock, you can maybe see horizontal parallel lines in the bark of the callus wood. And I'm counting them, and it looks like I'm getting about 20 of them, which would indicate that this tree was cut about 20 years before this photo was taken. Generally, callus wood, the bark of callus wood on any tree in the first few years lays down these annual growth lines in the bark. But in most trees, after about 4 or 5 years, you cannot clearly distinguish them anymore. But luckily, hemlock is a tree where you can see them up. I've counted them on some trees up to almost 50 years. So if you can see those lines, they're indicating each one on the bark there of the callus growing over the top of the stump is indicating each year's worth of growth. I'm seeing about 20. So this tree was cut about 20 years before the photo was taken. Eventually, if those root grafts hold, that callus will completely cover up the cut mark on the stump and will start to develop normal bark like a hemlock. And, if that tree retains its root grafts, it may grow to become an old growth stump that could be a few hundred years of age, but will only grow maybe a few more inches in height during that time frame. And I should mention, all of our regional coniferous trees, with the exception of pitch pine, if they're cut below the lowest living limb, they cannot resprout any limbs the way hardwoods can. So this tree is alive. It's getting its energy from surrounding trees it's root grafting to, which is allowing it to keep growing that callus wood, albeit at a very slow rate. But a great slide, whoever took that.
Yeah, great.
All right,
Thanks,
so
Tom.
yeah, here we have, it looks like a downed log, and I'm guessing this may be of a maple the reason I'm guessing that is you can see down in the middle of the slide a section where the moss is not apparent, and I'm seeing some of the wood that looks like it has a smooth black coating on it. And if that's the case, that's charcoal mat fungus. And it's a fungus that's in later stages of decay of trees like maples, beeches, and birches. So I'm guessing that may be the case here, if that is charcoal mat fungus. I should also mention this tree is starting to act as a nurse log. I can see what looks like possibly a birch growing up in the lower left-hand portion of it, and it looks like maybe a striped maple growing up sort of in the upper right-hand portion of it, which, if this is a hardwood tree, is unusual. Usually hardwoods are not good at being nurse logs because they decay pretty darn quickly. So most of our nurse logs we find in Vermont are created by either white pine or spruce. But if the person that took this slide knows anything more about the type of tree it was, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I don't know the species, but this was taken on one of our Vermont Woodlands Association woods walks, and just as a nurse log, we took the photo because it did have a number of seedlings on it, and I think actually the divot there you can sort of see about halfway through the picture. I think is actually where Alan Yale, who hosted the walk, actually pulled back part of the decayed wood for us to be able to kind of sort of feel it a little bit and be able to kind of explore it. But one of the questions that I had is, so interesting for you to comment on what species you think it is, and how. I mean, you mentioned you think it's sort of a further along in the decay process. How do you go about aging or putting kind of an age on how old a decayed log is? Is it based on kind of the accompanying fungus in the moss, or?
It's the way they decay, and it's different for different species. So, white pine logs generally in a mesic site, if they're a good sized log, will last about 70 to 80 years. On a dry site, they may go for over 100 years. Maple, beech, and birch generally are gone after about 30 to 35 years. They don't last very long. That's why they're usually not very good as nurse logs. They decay too quickly. So it depends on species of tree and decay rates. But what makes spruce and pine really good as nurse logs is they will persist a good, 70 years or more. They shed their bark after about 20 years. By 30 years, they get a really good coat of moss on them. And that's a great germination site for small seeded, shade tolerant trees. And then they decay slowly from the outside in, giving plenty of time for those trees to establish roots not only in the log, but around them and down in the ground. So they just make very, very good nurse logs.
Great. Well, hearing no further questions on this slide, let's keep going and see what's next.
All right, so here we have some blackberries, and obviously a good eating fruit. And I'm not sure if there was, oh, I can see on the right, there's a question. Why do they establish on sites after disturbance? They need basically full sun if they're going to grow effectively. Their seeds are big enough they can actually grow in areas that have vegetation on them already, like a grassy covering or something like that. But they absolutely need a lot of sunlight. So they're going to be early successional species coming in after any disturbance.
Tom, I heard this is kind of a specific question, but I did hear or saw some research from the Forest Service that indicated the viability of a black raspberry or raspberry seeds in the soil is somewhere between 40 to 60 years. Is that true? Do you know just how long their seeds remain viable?
Yeah, I didn't know that for specifically raspberries, but early successional plants, one of their strategies is to have very long seed longevity. Our later successional plants don't, because they're going into environments that are already suited for them. Early successional plants are going to disperse seeds far and wide, and those seeds, if the site isn't right, will sit and wait in the soil until there's a disturbance. So, for example, probably the extreme example of this are mullein. Now, this is not a native plant. This came from Europe. But mullein seeds can be viable in the soil for up to 1,000 years, just waiting for disturbance that exposes the soil to full sunlight. Because what breaks germination for them is getting soil temperatures that reach about 80 degrees. So they will not germinate unless they get a disturbance that completely exposes the soil to full sunlight. and then they'll come forth. So it's very common for our early successional plants to have great seed longevity.
Great. Well, thanks for commenting on that. Okay, here's our first participant photo. This is from Kathy O'Brien.
Okay, so I can't tell if this is a pine or a spruce, but what happened here is this tree was growing up and got bent over when it was very, very young. So it looks like it was growing up like this and got bent this way. And then probably the down portion of the tree at that point got too shaded and started to just die. But a branch coming off this side took off and came up as the new thing. So it's making like a nice turn like that. But that section that's coming off like this and going up would have been a side branch coming up off of the stem that was bent down towards the ground. So this could have been bent over with another tree falling on it as a young, seedling or sapling, or it could have been bent over by snow load, but it was definitely bent over and then recorrected by having a low branch come out and taking off as the new upward growing trunk.
Great. I'm just checking the chat to see if there's any further questions on this image.
Can't see images.
Kate, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Let's keep going then. Okay, this is a question, a photo that was submitted by Mary Pratt.
Okay, so the area's an island. Okay, so it looks, what I'm noticing right away is I'm seeing on the left-hand side of the tree some larger diameter trees, and then behind them, sort of going upslope towards the right, is a very dense young stand of trees. So my guess is if this was I'm not sure this was a pasture all the time. It looks like that young fringe of trees that's growing up slope, that's usually common in hayfields where bordering trees are sending out low limbs, it's creating shade, and then other trees, and it gets hard to mow in there. So other trees start coming up, and often if it isn't managed well, the hayfield just starts shrinking inward through time. But if this was in a pasture and there was an area of just woodland that was surrounded by pasture, it could have just been left as an area to provide shade for livestock that were in there during the summertime. I'd have to really be on the site to see it to infer that, because there might be something else going on here as well.
Great. I think there's a follow-up too. This is a second photo from Mary in a similar vicinity.
Yeah, so again, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, here's a good example of difference in structure. You're going to see the trees are smaller, they're much denser. On the left, I think it looks like there's a hemlock in the foreground. It looks like there's a double-trunked hardwood behind it, and bigger trees that are more widely spaced. So obviously, the area on the right was younger, abandoned more recently than the area on the left. So that's what I can see happening there. And I can't tell if that is I guess that's a stream going through there that's delineating the right versus the left-hand side. I can see water in there, and it looks like it's definitely like a small stream that's going through there. But definitely different age forest. The right-hand side, they're much younger, much more recently disturbed than the left-hand side.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And Mary, if you have any questions, we'll give you a second just to add any questions in. Hearing none, let's keep going.
Right. One other thing I'll just add, I can't really see it from the slide, but if I was on site, this is where I'd be looking at the superficial topography of the ground. If on the right it was smooth and even, and on the left it was lumpy, then I know the right-hand side at one time was pasture or hayfield. The left-hand side was either woodlot the right-hand side was crop field or hayfield, and the left-hand side was either woodlot or pasture. But I can't tell that from the slide, but that's what I'd be looking at in a place like this.
Well, Mary, if you want to go ahead and add additional information into the chat, we'll keep going, and we can always circle back. So here's the next photo, Tom.
Okay, we do have a question from a couple slides back in regards to the raspberries. It's regarding rubus species on a given disturbed site. Is there evidence of which species, blackberry or raspberry, will emerge based on soil site productivity?
Yeah, soils aren't going to be a big factor. It's just really the seed source that's there. So if let's say there's blackberries nearby as a seed source, it's probably going to come up to blackberries. If there's raspberries, it'll come up to raspberries because they're both, early successional species are generalists. They can handle a lot of different soil types, so that wouldn't be a very big factor.
And then on the photo that we were just looking at, Mary shared, thanks, that makes sense to me. It's an intermittent stream through there, and the road is pretty close to the right-hand side.
Okay. Now in this slide here, this looks like it's definitely probably pasture, still active pasture. I'd need to see more of it, but I'm seeing, either a ledge area in the upper area there that has shrubs on it, or that could be a stone dump. There's certainly, it looks like some stones with maybe a rod sticking out of them, a white rod sticking out of them, sort of down in the middle of the photo. But that would be my guess. So we're looking at a pasture here that has some areas that shrubs are coming up in because either the animals can't get at them. It could be a hayfield that's mowed and those areas can't be mowed. It's one of the two. I guess I'd have to be on site to tell for sure.
Yeah, and Doreen, if you're joining us, feel free to add more information in the chat or unmute yourself. My understanding is that this was a site that was recently cleared with some logging and that there is that agricultural history. And I think, Tom, she was wondering, if you have any ideas on what, this structure with that white fence pole, or temporary fencing, what that might have been used for. She has a comment when she submitted the photo that said that there's some mortar mixed in, I think. Doreen, I hope I got that right.
Well, it's a marker of some sort. So it might be a corner pin. I'd have to get on site to see it for sure, but it's definitely a marker. It's not, there to have a utilitarian a purpose of utility like for fencing or anything like that. It's marking that site for some reason.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Great. Well, Doreen, if you have additional information, feel free to chime in the chat. We have a few more photos from Doreen, so let's keep going. And I'll let you, speaking of rock piles, Tom.
Yeah, all right. So this is definitely abutting a crop field. So this is just a stone dump, but the critical thing is there's a lot of small stones in here that look to me about the size of a fist. Only fist-sized rock is going to come out of crop fields. Hay fields, some very large superficial rocks can rise out of a hay field. But in any site that has perennial roots, like lawns, hay fields, forests, places like that, perennial roots stitch everything together in the ground into a consolidated unit. And so when the ground freezes and expands and then thaws and settles, the rocks are held in place. But in a crop field that has no perennial roots, freeze and thaw cycles actually lift all the rocks up a little bit each year. So the way to think about this is think about a rock in the ground, the frost is coming down, latches onto the rock, and the frost continues down, the ground expands, and that rock gets lifted up a little bit. But what people don't realize is when the thaw commences, it commences from the bottom up because once you get below the frost zone around here, you're getting down to soil temperatures in the 50s degree range. So there's a great heat reservoir down there. So as the winter abates, the cold can't get as far down in the ground anymore, the thaw zone migrates up. That area that the rock was lifted out of thaws and settles first, and the rock can't get to its original starting point. So in this way, all rocks are slowly moved up and they got to be picked out of the crop field. And so when you see small rocks, fist-sized rocks in a pile like this or incorporated into a stone fence, you're looking at an area that abutted a crop field.
Great. Interesting. Okay, here's another one from Doreen.
All right, so this looks like we're getting, again, maybe some weevil hit pines in here. There's a tree on the right that looks like it may be weevil hit, very definitely low limbs and stuff. So my guess is we're looking at an area that was, and that looks like if that was a weevil hit tree, it threw up a lot of trunks. So that might have been a tree growing on its own in a pasture before it was abandoned. Oh, there is a stone wall or foundation. I didn't see that. I can see moss on something, but I can't make out if that's ledge or laid up stone. I can't really tell.
Yeah, it does look like there is some laid up stone, Tom. I like that way of describing it. And I think Doreen was wondering, if how might you tell in general, of if the stone is a foundation or if it's a stone wall?
Well,
What are some of the
yeah, this definitely does not look as like a stone wall because behind it you have soil that's right up to the top. Um, I'd really like to see this site because something like this makes me right off think that maybe we're looking at some sort of barn foundation structure on old cellar holes. If we get cellar holes of houses that were built before 1830, we'll usually get this central stone structure rising up in the cellar hole that's, often, 8 feet by 8 feet in size, in solid stone, laid up stone. That's what's called a basement. And that would have been the foundation of the central chimney system. Uh, Today, cellar and basement have become synonymous because basements were adjacent to the cellar hole, but the basement was the foundation of a chimney. I would have to see what this is, but it's not a stone fence because it looks like, you know, right behind it, the soil's right up to the level of that stonework, if that is laid up stone. So it's more likely has something to do with some sort of foundation work.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, Doreen, if you have any questions or additional comments to share, please feel free to use the chat. But we'll keep moving. It's great.
Yeah, so this is probably hay-scented fern. Hay-scented fern is a fern that once establishes just clones right out and can very much restrict regeneration in the understory of a forest. What gets them going is a pretty good gap dynamic. So if you have a logging operation or something like that that opens up big canopy gaps, you already have hay-scented fern in the understory, it can really encourage that fern to just take off and really clone right over the whole thing. And when it gets this dense, you can see you're not getting any regeneration happening in there because it really restricts regeneration because it's such a dense shaded area that young seedlings can't successfully establish.
I think the comment from Tessa was this site definitely, does have a history of pasture land use. And so it sounds like that disturbance is part of the story here that has allowed the hay-scented fern to become established.
It could be, but I think actually, the hay-scented fern would not be in a pasture. The livestock walking around would trample it out. So it would have come in after abandonment, but would have needed pretty good gap dynamic to get a growth like this.
I guess what I mean, Tom, is, what about soils, right? So, I mean, would the pasture land use have impacted the soils at all?
Well, I mean, this fern is like moderate sided. It's a fern that probably the soils are not as big a factor as having a woodland area that gets a pretty good gap dynamic.
Okay.
We do have two questions on this photo. One is hay-scented fern considered to be an invasive?
Well, it's a native, but it acts like that. We do have species that can act like an invasive, and this is one, but it's a native species.
And then our second question on this one is what can be done to foster regrowth in these conditions?
Well, one thing that can be done, I mean, I'm sure there's probably a way to treat the fern to remove it. I don't know what that would be. I've never done it. But I would say in a forest like this, if you could start planting some trees in there, it wouldn't have to take very many, something like a hemlock or something like that. A couple of hemlocks in there, as they grow up, would produce shade, which would then start restricting the hay-scented fern and then start allowing more regeneration of trees to come in. Hemlock is very shade tolerant, so maybe that wouldn't be the best choice. Maybe better putting in sugar maple or something like that. But I'd say in a site like this, just a few sapling trees being seeded in there, planted in there would probably start to really help a lot.
Awesome. Thanks. That's all the questions we have for this photo. And folks that are asking general questions in the chat, I am taking note of them, but we'll circle back to them at the end if we have time, and we'll just be answering questions specific to the photos right now.
Great. Thanks, Liza. Let's keep going.
Okay, so here we have an ash, and if this whoever took this photo, if this bark was squishy, if you could put your finger on the bark and push it in a little bit so it felt a little bit corky, that would be a green ash. And if the bark is really solid and you can't push it in at all, that would be a white ash. Generally, I'm thinking might be green ash, because green ash often sheds bark like this. This is very common in green ash. White ash can do it too, but it's much, much more common in green ash. And I'm also seeing little flakes down below the hand, little flakes coming up, which is not that common in white ash. So I'm guessing we're looking at green ash here. Usually in Vermont, it's going to be adjacent to, riparian areas. It likes a pretty moist soil. I know up where we are in Maine, it occurs throughout the forest just because we get so much fog up there. But down usually, in Vermont, you're going to be seeing it more in moist substrates. But again, the key is the bark. If the bark's a little bit squishy, if you push on it with your finger and it squishes a little bit, that would be green ash. And I'm guessing that's what we're looking at here.
Scott, who this is his photo, said that the interior bark is firm and the soil is generally very moist in this area.
So how about that outer bark, the stuff that hasn't flaked off? Is that squishy at all? A little bit. It's not gonna be real squishy, but you can push it in a little bit if it's green ash.
The outer seemed squishy.
Yeah, that's green ash, and that is typically green ash to shed bark like that.
Great. And then in Scott's comments, he also asked about emerald ash borer, and of course, that's a concern here in Vermont. Any thoughts or comments regarding emerald ash borer and green ash?
Well, green ash is going to be assaulted just like white ash is going to be assaulted. It's a big problem. I would suggest that, we need to be, I think, a little bit more conservative in how we deal with it. Generally, in a continental context, it's unusual for a pathogen like this to extinguish a species. So, for example, 5,000 years ago, eastern hemlock was established throughout its present range. We know that from pollen records. And then between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, we can find no eastern hemlock pollen anywhere. It just disappeared. But by 4,000 years ago, boom, the pollen is back. So some pathogen came in about 5,000 years ago, almost completely exterminated eastern hemlock. But when you have a continental sort of population, there's enough genetic diversity, you're going to have individual trees that are going to be resistant. And that becomes the breeding material for that species. And that's why I've heard a lot of people saying, we just need to cut the ash, we're going to lose it. And ash is not a vigorous stump sprouter, and it would be terrible just go out wholesale cutting stuff, because we may be taking out trees that are resistant and not even know it. So I'd say we ought to be, I think, a bit more cautious about how we're dealing with this, because I'd hate to see us be just wholesale cutting out all the ash and maybe taking out trees that really have resistance, and that would really then be an injustice to the species in terms of it coming back. I'm pretty confident that pretty much all of our trees will recover from their pathogens, and we can see certain trees already doing that, a certain species already doing that. So I think that, I guess the one that I'm really concerned about is beech now, because of having not just beech bark scale disease, but beech leaf disease. That is a very, very potent double whammy. I'm not quite sure how that is going to work out. And with beech bark scale disease, what happens is beeches are on the interior tree that root sprouts. So as beech trunks sicken, they send up root sprouts, which are clones and genetically identical. They eventually get hit, they root sprout, and you start generating these very dense understories of beech. Again, here's a species that when you get those root sprouts, it starts acting like an invasive. It restricts everything. So it's a problem because actually what's happening with beech bark scale disease is that natural selection is selecting for non-resistant trees that keep root sprouting vigorously, and about 3% of our beech are resistant to the disease, but in those beech understories that are all root sprouted, they can't establish. So it's natural selection is actually selecting against resistant trees and beech. So it's a real big problem.
Hmm. That's really interesting, and interesting to have the historical context as well. Well, let's keep going because I think we do have some more some of these topics we be revisiting in other pictures. So let's a few more from Scott here.
All right, so this looks like it's a pine or a hemlock with maybe some ash growing around it. I'm guessing those are young ash. All that's happening here is that that conifer, which I can't tell if it's a pine or a hemlock, it's one of the two, I think, was already here, and there was a good germination site for these hardwoods to sprout. And so the future of these trees is they're probably going to be fine, and they may graft together. I have seen in two instances now coniferous trees root grafted onto hardwood trees. So this happened in one site in Ashfield, Massachusetts. A neighboring hemlock and yellow birch were uprooted by a wind event. And the tip up, you'd see these perfect grafts. So it may be that these trees could root graft together. That's a potential that may happen. But if it doesn't, as long as they can get adequate sunlight between the three of them, they should be fine.
Great. All right, let's keep going. So here's this is a picture from David, and he was wondering, he thought maybe this might be American chestnut. Wondering for your thoughts on that, Tom.
Boy, I'd need to see more of it, but it could be. I mean, that bark, a chestnut has a bark that looks like a hybridization between maple and oak, and I'm seeing that in this slide, but I'd really need to see more of it to really be sure. Um, I'd say that, on a site like this, looking down at the ground might be a help, because if there is chestnut there, you're going to see the distinct chestnut leaves down there on the ground, for that were dropped the year before. Or looking up in the canopy, you might be able to tell, because they're going to have a leaf that looks like a beech, but it'll be quite longer with more pronounced teeth that are bigger. But if this is a chestnut, it looks like it's pretty good size, and I'd have to say that it would be all by itself, most likely, to have attained this size and not have been hit by the blight. I should mention, in the last decade or so, I have encountered in New England 5 different stands of American chestnut that are not being taken out right away by the blight. They're making it to about 12, 14 inches in diameter, and they're encapsulating the blight fungus in cankers that start ringing the tree. Sometimes you'll see 6 of these cankers growing up, and eventually they kill the tree. But those trees are probably making it to a good 50 years of age before dying. And in those forests, all throughout the understory, you're going to find holes and seedlings of American chestnut. So in those forests, we're having chestnut that is cross-pollinating, reproducing, and my guess is each generation is probably getting a bit more resistant than the previous generation. I think in sites like that, that's where we see the chestnut make its return. So I think that's like I was saying, I think with most of our trees, we're going to find that they're going to be all right in the long run, but it's going to take about a millennia probably before we start to see them really coming back strong again.
We do have 2 comments on this photo. One is a little bit of context from David. He says, it's in line with pasture / field with a stone dump, and the field is to the right. Line is now the property line. And then the question that we have on this is, why is the American chestnut tree had a lack of genetic diversity such that truly resistant or not able to compensate and begin to expand their areas of growth?
Well, like I was saying, I've found 5 stands where that is happening. So the trees right now are making it to about 50 years of age. after being infected by the blight, but I think the next generation may make it to 70, and then the generation after that might make it to 90. And after a number of generations, we will see in those sites those chestnuts coming back out and expanding their ranges. So the two biggest sites I know of are on Mount Everett in the southwest corner of Massachusetts, and each are about 60-acre stands that you have, probably 6, 7 dozen trees in the canopy that are blossoming and producing viable chestnuts. So,
Wow, that's great. That's kind of exciting, Tom,
Yeah.
to think about that. So that's great. Good. Okay, well, let's keep going. We have another question here from David, specifically about the white coral, the
Yeah,
fungus.
this is a coral fungus, and I don't know. I'm not an expert on mushrooms, so I don't know if this is a mycorrhizal fungus that interacts with the roots of photosynthetic plants, or if it's a decomposer that's just part of the decomposition process of breaking down organic material in the soil. So I don't really know which role it's playing here. But if it is mycorrhizal, it's playing, well, or either way, it's playing a very important role in terms of either recycling nutrients into the soil or linking up all the photosynthetic plants in a forest into a more resilient forest, because mycorrhizal fungi allow any plant that associates with them to dramatically increase moisture and nutrient uptake. And that becomes really important on acidic sites where nutrients are leached out quickly. The mycorrhizae quickly grab them and then shut them to those photosynthetic plants. So whatever this fungus is, it's doing an important role, whether it's doing decomposition or whether it's functioning as a mycorrhizal species.
Great. Let's go. Let's keep going. So here's another question from David.
Yeah, so this looks like we have a seep here. So this would mean that we have an uphill area that looks like it's uphill going up to the upper right. Groundwater's moving down slope and is hitting some sort of layer that is somewhat impervious to water. So there could be a ledge layer underneath here, or it could be a layer of clay that's causing that water to surface at this spot. So that's what's happening here.
Great. I'm just looking, I know we have a few more photos left, so let's keep rolling. And then if folks have questions or additional comments, please feel free to use the chat.
All right, so here it looks like an area. I was talking about pit and mound or pillow and cradle topography. We may have that going on here. I'm looking at the center of the slide, and I'm seeing a trio of 3 trees. They may be hemlock or pine that are growing on a mound. And it looks like on the left-hand side of that mound, there is a depression. So this is what's called, I don't know if I can do it with my hand, but I can try. Pit and mound topography, or pillow and cradle topography. And that's the result of live trees being taken down by wind events or snow or ice loading. So when a live tree falls down, its roots rip up out of the ground, making it what's called a tip up. So you have the upturned roots. And they bring up a lot of excavated earth as well. So the cradle would be the depression that's over here. Then you have the tip up. And eventually, as those roots decay, the excavated soil settles to form a mound or a pillow. So if that's what this is here, the wind would have been coming out of, if this is a wind event, would have been coming out of the left-hand side of the slide, hitting a tree and knocking it over this way. So that's what I was talking about. If you get into areas that have lumpy ground, that's from pillows and cradles that were there from previous wind events or snow and ice events. And in our woodlands, because we have such a robust disturbance regime here in New England, after a couple of centuries, our forest floors just get carpeted in pillows and cradles, and big ones can be visible for about 1,000 years after the event that took down the live tree. So again, if they're missing, that means you're looking at areas that were plowed. Now, looking at the left-hand side of this photo here, going up slope, that looks to me like the ground is, even though it's sloping down, is pretty smooth and even on the surface. So that's what I'm catching in this slide. I'd actually like to get in this site to see more of it to know if that's the case, but that's my first impression, that we might be looking at a pillow and cradle here in the foreground, and upslope the ground might be smooth and even.
Hmm. Great. And I have to congratulate David because it's not easy to capture a picture of the
Yeah.
pillow and cradles, Tom, as I'm sure you've experienced. It's a hard concept to get a picture of. I know we have one more image that I think aligns really nice with this conversation. So I'm going to keep moving. And Eliza, if there are any questions, feel free to jump in. But this is actually just a photo that from the Vermont Woodlands team, and again, trying to capture that tip and mound topography.
So yeah, so this looks like, again, I'm seeing the cradle just above that NW, the northwest sign, and the mound sort of above the arrow. This would most likely have been from a thunderstorm, a microburst. So generally, you're going to get the most impact from microbursts on the eastern facing slope, which this would be, because the winds are coming down in a way that they're going to hit the slope in that way and take the trees down. But generally, winds out of the west are from microbursts. Winds out of the east are going to be from the occasional hurricane or tropical storm that impacts a site. So that's a general rule of thumb. Now, I have to admit, that is changing. So, for example, we live up in coastal Maine. In the last 2 winters, we have had 6 storms generating winds of hurricane force that are coming out of the southeast that have absolutely nothing to do with tropical storms. That's something that's brand new. We've never seen before. And it's going to make what I've written about in reading the Forested Landscape in terms of interpreting wind events, it's going to put another layer in, because now we're starting to see hurricane force winds that are coming out of directions that are not related to tropical storms at all. So it's changing.
Interesting. And that's why I included the directional, indications here,
Yeah.
was to kind of give you a better sense of the lay of the land. And the hurricane of 48,
38.
38, I'm sorry, excuse me. That direction, sort of the tip and mounds of that one would be similar in.
It depends. I guess in Vermont, I was going to say it depends where you are in New England, but in Vermont, yeah, most of those winds were coming out of the southeast. So the trees would have had the mound on the northwestern side and the cradle on the southeastern side from the 38 hurricane.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes
And I
sense.
mentioned that hurricane was really unique because of the speed it traversed through New England. It was moving, basically northeast at a speed of about 45 miles an hour. In other words, the eye of the storm was moving 45 miles northeastward every hour. That is really fast for a hurricane. And it's why it hung together as a hurricane almost all the way through Vermont. In most cases, Vermont rarely sees hurricanes because they fall down to tropical storm status before they even get to Vermont. But because of the speed of that storm, it was a full-fledged hurricane through basically 2/3 of the state in terms of, north-south direction, because it was just advancing so quickly.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, let's keep going. I have a few more slides, and I know we're starting to.
So I can't tell if that is a rock or not. Is that a rock that we're seeing projecting out there?
It is, yeah. And this photo was submitted by Kathy Beeland, who is our Vermont Tree Farm Program manager with Vermont Woodlands Association, and she shared this photo with me. And curious for your thoughts on it. I believe that's a rock that's protruding out at the top, and then it's kind of laying on top of another boulder
Boy,
or rock.
I would love to see. I mean, something like this can happen from the glaciers where you get a number of boulders that are dropped together in place. But boy, that is pretty unusual. I would really like to see this because this could have some other, pre-colonial origin related to indigenous peoples. That's a possibility. I don't know. We do have indigenous stonework, but this is unique enough. I'd like to see the site. But it's one of the two. It's either pre-colonial indigenous stonework, or it's just a freak of the way 2 boulders got dropped by the glacier in place.
Kathy has offered a little bit of context saying that this rock is at the base of a ledge in the toe slope, if that helps to have you lean either way.
Well, if the ledge was right adjacent to it, then it could be rock that cleaved off and fell down like this, and that would be pretty easy to understand that that might just be a natural event. But that ledge would have to be pretty close by to drop a rock like that would get tipped up like this. So how far away is that ledge, let's say horizontally from that tilting rock?
It's adjacent, maybe 40 feet.
Yeah, that's pretty far out. And how tall is the ledge?
For 50 to 60 feet.
Yeah, that is pretty far out for a ledge of that height. So I'd still like to see the site.
Interesting. Okay, great. Well, we Kathy can be in touch and we can talk more about it. I believe it's in Chittenden, so southern Vermont, if that's additional context, that's helpful. But let's keep moving because we have a few more photos to get through. I'm actually just going to skip this, Tom, because I know we have a few more to get through, and I think we're getting tight on time, and this was one of our submissions. We talked a little bit about beech, but this was one that from the team at Vermont Woodlands Association. Just any comments on, sort of the role of beech, ecologically in our forests and for wildlife?
So our trees that have large seeds in the form of nuts, so oaks with acorns, beech with beech nuts, chestnut with chestnut nuts, hickories with hickory nuts, and even our conifers that have a lot of seeds stored in sizable cones like white pine or things like that. All those trees have developed a strategy called masting. And mast is the European term for the husk of a nut. And what masting is in species that do this, they do not produce seeds every year. They intentionally forego seed production for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years in a row. And during that time, they're storing energy in the form of starch in their roots. And then within species, because they communicate together, they come forth with what's called a mast year, where they all then, let's say all the beech, or maybe it's all the oak or all the pine, produce a huge bumper crop of seeds. And that's the mast year. And this is a strategy to thwart seed consumers. So in oaks, the major consumer is the acorn weevil. So if anyone's picked up an acorn and seen a little hole in the acorn shell, that's the exit hole of the weevil. So in July, female acorn weevils are up in the canopy of oaks. Any acorn they find, they lay an egg in. That hatches out into larvae that eats the acorn. It doesn't eat all the meat of it, but it destroys that acorn's viability. So if all the oaks in a region, and the region could be as big as all of New England, suppress acorn production for a number of years in a row, they dramatically depress the weevil population and overwhelm them in the mast year. So this is common again in our species that have large seeds or concentrated seeds and cones. Now, our berry producing trees don't do this because they want to encourage their fruit to be eaten and then have their seeds dispersed by the animals that are eating it. In our small seeded trees, like our early successional trees, like birches, aspens, things like that, they don't do this as well. It's only our large seeded trees that do this, and it's a strategy to thwart seed consumption.
Great. Very interesting. Thanks, Tom. Let's keep going. And I may have to skip a few more here as we get through the rest of these.
Yeah, so here we have, again, another type of coral fungus. And like I said before, this is a different species. I don't know if these are decomposers or mycorrhizal, but another species of coral fungus.
So, another species of coral fungus, you said. Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay, cool. Excellent. Another question from Kathy, curious for your thoughts. This was a vernal pool, I guess, here in the picture. The question really is, how can you tell if it's a natural vernal pool or, if it's been influenced by land use? And what you can't see is that there's actually a stone wall on the right-hand side of this vernal pool just out of the shot. So with that tidbit of
Yeah.
additional information. What are your
Uh,
thoughts?
So, I mean, generally, this looks like it's probably natural to me. I mean, the only other way we get it is if you excavate soil from a barrow, which is usually taking material out for road construction or some other purpose. And usually you're going to see a change in the topography of the area. This looks like on the far slope, it's just gradually, gradually coming down. And I'm not seeing like a point where it's gradually coming down and then really changes like it's been dug out. So my guess is if the topography looks like it's gradual coming down into that depression, it's probably just a natural feature and has nothing to do with human activity.
Okay. Makes sense. That's great. So now we're going to get into a series of different kind of foundation and types of. So
Yeah,
yeah.
so this definitely a cellar hole that was abandoned quite a while ago because I can't quite tell what hardwood this is, grew up and then got cut and stump sprouted. So this structure has been gone for quite a while, definitely over a century. This house is abandoned to get something like that growing in the cellar hole.
And you think it's cut because of the stumps, the
Yeah,
sprouts, the
yeah,
stump sprouts? Yeah.
stump sprouted. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it'd be interesting if this cellar hole has that central large buildup of stone in the middle as the foundation for the central chimney system. That would let us know that was, a cellar hole that predates 1830. In 1830, what happens is cast iron wood stove production takes off, making wood stoves pretty much economically available to everybody. And instead of building that massive central chimney system, which took up a lot of room in a house with all the fireplace hearths, chimneys go to the outside walls that wood stoves hook into, and then you don't have a basement in your cellar hole. You just have a completely open cellar hole.
Hmm.
So
How interesting.
if this one had the basement, that would tell us, yeah, this place was the foundation was pre 1830.
Interesting. Okay. We might have another photo that I'd love you to comment more about that on. Let's keep going. Here's another one from Kathy with the question sort of point of kind of multiple foundations in an area. And I'll let you comment on the photos, but I think the question was, could this potentially be an example of a community center or, at least maybe kind of an older development, if you will, of multiple houses or buildings in an area
Well, it
based
looks
on.
more like just different areas of a farmscape. So that upper photo on the left is a single stacked stone wall. So that's a stone wall that was built either to keep livestock in pastures or out of hay fields. So that is a wall that is associated with either hay fields or pastures. The middle photo, you can see on the left, we have a stone dump there. It's not really built up into a wall. I'm guessing that right-hand side there above the stone was a crop field, and they just dumped stuff there. And then it looks like we have maybe a woods road or an old road going down right through that line of older maple trees. So I'm just thinking we're looking at different stone walls related to different agricultural activities in this area.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I think one of her comments was the width of the road, she thought in that top or so middle photo, might be an indication that there was more than one use or more than one family. Do you ever, yeah, is that an indication that you look at kind of, in terms of the width of the road
Yeah,
for helping to kind of.
that is definitely at least a two-rod road, which that means that's a town road. That is not a road that's just within a farmscape. Farm roads were basically just wide enough for their cart. This is a wider town road. So yes, I mean we could have different property owners, or we could just have one farm with a town road running through it. That's either is a possibility.
Yeah, now speaking of roads, here's another photo from Kathy, and these are just so cool. I know we're going over a little bit, Tom, but I do hopefully folks will bear with us here and we can take a look at some more of these photos. This is what Kathy describes as an old railroad bed.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious for your thoughts and
Well, I I I
comments.
I would believe her. I mean, I can't really tell from the photo, but you know, it definitely could have been a railroad bed. And if it was used to move granite, that means that upslope, if you follow this up, you're going to come to a quarry.
Yeah.
And that would definitely confirm, yes.
Yeah, and I think I think this is outside of Cunningsville, and I think that there is a quarry on top of the hill. And I'll just add, as before we switched to the next photo, is Kathy indicated to me in a phone conversation that she has found evidence of fire scars in some of the older trees upslope, indicating maybe that that there may have be that may be an indication of the railroad coming through.
Yeah,
But
very
it might
possibly.
further exploration of that site is probably warranted.
Yeah,
And
especially
next time,
burning coal, yeah, that could definitely spark fires. And if those fire scars are up on the uphill sides of trees on the slope, that's very good evidence of fire.
interesting. Yeah, so you confirm that. So Kathy, next time you're out there, we should take more photos, I think, is the take home message on this one.
And I should
Great.
mention why on slopes, uphill fire scars or fire scars happen on uphill slopes. It's because on a slope, branches, logs, everything gets pulled downhill by gravity, and you build up fuel pockets on the uphill side. Fire burns up a slope. The downhill side of the tree has very little fuel, so it doesn't burn there very long, but it gets on the uphill side and burns there a long time, creating the scar in the uphill side of the tree. That's why if you see a lot of uphill scars on trees in a slope, very good evidence of fire.
Interesting. Well, let's shift gears a little bit, Tom. So this is a photo from Vermont Woodlands, and this is actually a town forest here in the Sharon area. It's the Stratford town line. It's the Ashley Community Forest, and you'll see here's some pictures of the foundations. But one of the main questions, and I'd like you to comment on those. But there's a lot of black locusts around the site, and I'd like you to comment a little bit on the presence of black locusts.
Well, a lot of houses in Vermont, would plant either 2 or 4 big maples. Well, they weren't big when they planted them. They're small maple trees, sugar maples out in front of the house that eventually grew up to be big trees as these, houses were built in the, late 1700s, early 1800s as they aged. But locust was always also used for that. I know down in the southern part of the state, you can see a lot of older houses that have 2 or 4 huge locust trees now growing in front of them. In this case, these locusts are all quite a bit younger. So, I guess this is just a forest that they may have planted locusts for fencing. It was very popular in fencing, as well as for rot-resistant timbers that could be used in various structures. And they root clone. So once they're planted, they will clone out.
Oh, interesting. Okay. One thing I've heard over the years is that black locust was planted around old farmhouses as lightning protection. Is that something that you've heard?
I've heard it, but I can't verify if that's the case or not, but I have heard that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's keep going. A few more questions for you. This one from Mark. Curious for you to just make some generalized comments on the influence of beaver in our landscape here.
Well, they have a huge influence. I mean, they create a myriad of, sort of habitats we wouldn't have otherwise. So there's a great book called Eager, and it really goes in the natural history of the beaver. And, parts of this country looked completely different than they do today. If you go out to the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, areas like that where beaver were really present before being extirpated, it looked really, really different back in the 1800s than it does today because they had such a big impact on the landscape.
Great. Well, I'm sure lots more information. You could probably spend a whole hour, Tom, talking about the influence of beaver and that resource, that book. Let's keep going. This is another photo that was submitted by Kathy, and I'll let you see the note here on the side.
I can see it, and it's very possible. I mean, I can't verify that by looking at the slide, but I wouldn't necessarily doubt it. We do have, like I said, there's a lot of stone artifacts of indigenous cultures in New England, so I wouldn't doubt it.
And I think what one thing that was pointed out to me is along the bottom, kind of you can see underneath the ledge, looks like there may be some charcoal evidence.
Oh, okay.
Any thoughts on how to date that or sort of verify?
No, I don't think I could do that. But my wife is just showing me a sign, says it's 1:20, and I have another appointment at 2, and it's about a half an hour away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tom. I guess my clock said 1:15, so I thought we had a few extra minutes here. And to be honest, we have you, and it's so interesting to hear you talk and share all this information. It's kind of contagious and hard to stop. So
I appreciate
let's
that.
forgive me for not wrapping us up more closely. And we did have a few more questions, but we'll have to leave it there for today. The good news is for those folks who are joining us that Tom will be joining us on Saturday for a guided walk and a lunch at the Northwood Stewardship Center. So for folks who are available and for folks who've already signed up, we look forward to seeing you on Saturday, and it'll be a great opportunity to get into the woods with Tom and explore some more of these topics and questions face to face. I did want to mention to folks there are 2 spots that have just opened up this morning. The walk as of this morning was full, but we had 2 cancellations for the afternoon walk. So if anybody is interested in participating, there are now 2 spots that are open in the afternoon. I have my email address there on the slide, and so please reach out and we'll get you signed up. So with that, Tom, boy, I just thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing this wealth of information. I just, spending some time with you, looking at these pictures has just been wonderful. And I've really enjoyed this opportunity to learn with you and explore, all of these different questions and curiosities about our forests. So, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I hope that, obviously we'll see you on Saturday, and we'll have the opportunity to get out in the woods with you on Saturday. But I hope that we bring you back. I hope that this is the start of more of these events, because I think as we see now and starting to learn about how to take better pictures of some of these features, your insights are really quite informative and helpful. And as I said in the beginning, very inspiring. And so with that, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Tom, for joining us today. And thank you to all the participants who have hung out with us over this last 15 minutes here. I know we've gone over. Really appreciate everybody's questions, time. Your participation really enriched the program today. And so thank you so much. And I hope that as you head out into the woods today, I hope that you're bringing with you new ideas and questions and curiosities about our forests here in Vermont. And don't forget, we as Vermont Woodlands Association and Vermont Land Ethic, or Land Ethic Vermont, as one of the partners on this presentation today, this is what we do. We are here to help, and we look forward to supporting you in your journey as a landowner and your work in the woods, and helping you to explore all of your curiosities about our forests here in Vermont and how we can care for it. So with that, thank you so much, Tom. We appreciate your time today, and we look forward to those who are fortunate enough to be able to join us on Saturday. We look forward to the opportunity to see you in the woods.
All right. Well, bye-bye, everyone.
And just a reminder to folks who are hoping to get SAF credits, just to put your name and your license number in the chat, and then I will get all of that sorted. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'll be hanging out for a second if there's anybody who has any any questions or any additional, but we'll let Tom go.